I'm happy to leave this open for as long as whoever wants to stay.
I think last week we stayed for, it was close to an hour, so you don't have to. You can stay for another 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever is suitable for you is fine. You know, I don't really have anything till later in the day, so I can hang out here for a while.
I'm gonna have to love and leave everybody. It has been a treat as usual, but yeah, I have to go. So I'll see you next week. Take care, guys.
Thank you, Diego. See you next week.
And Kwabena, there is a question directly addressed to you there. You want to get us started for the post and continuing the conversation?
Yeah, so the question is if I would agree, women tend to be as easy targets for physical violence too. And of course I would agree to that. And I would agree to specific gender-based violence against women, right? Sexual assault and other forms. You know, I'm not, you know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to say that like one, violence is universal or equal across the board, or two, women don't experience gender-based violence, or they experience in the same quantities or even qualities as men. None of those are my points at all. My simple point is simply that when we talk about gender-based violence, we seem to be conflating violence against women, which is a thing, no question about it. Again, I've seen, I don't want to start going through the experiences I have, because once I feel like I got to go through the experiences that I have for people to start taking me seriously, but I don't feel like going through that shit. So that is a thing.
I shouldn't be laughing.
It's a thing. It's a thing. Violence against women is a thing. There's no questions about that. No, nothing about that. But the issue here is whether we conflate gender-based violence, which should include men, cis het men too, cis heterosexual men for those who don't know the lingo, should include cis het men too. You know what I'm saying? And I don't want to, and I feel sometimes that like that sort of, it's just like, you know, those men are at the bottom of the ladder, and so, you know, there's an hierarchy placed there, and then so we don't, the violence that they experience doesn't get talked about. That's a space of patriarchy, one that I can tell you I know and seen just enough of. That's a space of patriarchy. We need to talk about that, and we can't just move it to the bottom or put it in this hierarchy. We have to deal with that.
The violence that you're speaking about, that you're saying is specifically targeted at men and boys, would you say that's gang related, or what is that about?
It's everything from domestic abuse to gang related. So everything. I was hit on by my fucking high school teacher. Like, do I have to start going into stories? Do I have to start going into stories? I can, you know what I'm saying? Like,
I'm just trying to understand, I suppose, because I also come from, like, I know it's definitely not the same. In South Africa, we've got like townships. So they are where like Black people kind of it was a construct of apartheid. So almost like projects kind of, I'm not sure. Maybe you guys can tell me more about that, but it's where like, basically in terms of similarities to ghettos or projects in America, it's just areas of depression, poverty, food insecurity, crime, and lots of violence. And in terms of South Africa, our stats, we will always hear about our crime stats being very, very high. But if you actually break that down in terms of like where the crime is happening, you'll see there's like hotspots, and they tend to be in these townships as well. So this is kind of where like I come from. So but I'm just trying to understand like as a male living in that environment, I knew obviously everyone universally knows that the area is unsafe, like at certain times of the early hours of the morning. and at night. So physical violence can affect anyone. However, I felt for like my fellow cousins who are female, there was an added layer of rape because it's very prevalent in South Africa, and sexual assault. And I was never spoken to. None of my friends who are cis het and gay have ever like spoken about that being a fear of them in that space. However, we all knew, all of us, everyone that stays in the community, that in terms of physical violence, young and old, you were at danger. But when rape was spoken about, it was kind of spoken about as a gender thing. And that's why I think in our country, it's grouped specifically as GBV, as gender violence. There are men that obviously get raped, but the numbers are so low. So that's why I'm trying to think about, and without taking into account gang related stuff, I'm just trying to think about and trying to understand the GBV that is targeted at men, because I guess I don't understand.
Yeah, so I think when you just said you discounted the gang related stuff, I mean, that's discounting something, the kind of assault that, you know, that I've witnessed, experienced daily growing up in one of those project like areas. And I went to school in the projects. Right, like, so it was like those, that kind of violence where like you getting jumped, you walking home and like, you know, somebody, you know, kids is on the corner, they're gonna holler at the girls, right? So they're gonna say some misogynist, sexist stuff to the girls. But the physical assault is not like that physical assault isn't gonna happen to the girls, right? Like a rape, a sexual assault, that I think is gonna happen to the girls and women, right? The physical assault of you just walking on the corner and somebody just coming in your face, like that is not, that is the kind of, like, that's the kind of violence that happens to men, perpetrated by other men, that doesn't seem to have the kind of equivalent to women. And again, this is not to say that women don't have problems, but also women weren't on the corners, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? This is a public space where, you know, men on the corners, they shooting dice, you know what I'm saying? They getting into trouble. And so, and this is one space, this is what I've seen, experienced, you know what I'm saying? You know, my brother got robbed. They robbed him for his jacket. It's funny now, but like,
yeah, Sam Corbini, like you laugh at it now, yeah.
Another time I ended up fighting. Like I ended up, we ended up getting in. That's why I'm saying violence is sort of constitutive of the lives there, you know. And so, and that seems to be something specifically that men have to deal with in ways that women do not have to deal with. So in that sense, in that regard, that's one way that I can construct gender-based violence in the kind of areas that you're talking about.
But Ben, to add on to your point, kind of like, it seems like your main issue is like gender-based violence is understood from the perspective of solely women. And I honestly feel like I agree with you to a fair degree. It's just in general, I feel like what Maxi Call is trying to bring up is that like often when you do bring men into discussion, when you're trying to focus on women, you have a lot of detractors. I'm sure you've experienced this, Kwabena. You have a lot of masculine detractors. When they do come into the discussions, it's like, I see everybody deals with this, and it's a great way to kind of undermine the issues of women. But in terms of your antidotes, I like relate the same way. I think like the general experience, like how violence forms the male experience is often ignored, because growing up in Saginaw, like, it's kind of crazy that happens in Brooklyn too. You have men, like young groups of men sitting on corners throwing dice. Like, it's crazy that getting robbed is like this communal comedic experience, and having to fight for your stuff is like a communal comedic experience, when in reality it's just like a masculine way of handling like violent trauma, if you're being like honest about it. And I hate to use that language, I mean, because you know, just the general resistance about acknowledging things that are sensitive. But it is really interesting, and I definitely see your point. Like, yeah, that was part of our life.
I've got more to add, but I think I'm just gonna give the floor to kind of the females like in the room, just to not dominate the space, and just hear from them perhaps, before I carry on.
I have a question for Kwabena.
Mhm.
You speak about violence, physical violence in particular, being targeted towards men, right? Don't you often, and from where you're from, right? And I'm not invalidating your lived experiences, but I just want to ask, maybe the question should also be, who are the perpetrators of this violence? That's the main question. Yes, men are violated against, yes, women are violated against, but the question now is, who are the perpetrators and how can we then deal with that? When we speak about GBV, of course, we include men in it, but the layer of it, I think Mastole talked about that, and he said women experience it more. The question should really be now, who are the perpetrators often? Yeah. If you can respond to that.
Yeah, so I totally agree that the perpetrators, I think I said this, the perpetrators of this violence are mainly men. But when we categorize the perpetrator, when we start talking about perpetrators and victims, and we're asking, I think we're asking different questions about than a question about patriarchy. Right, because I think when we, it's just my worry is that, like, we conflate patriarchy and we start talking about the institutions of patriarchy, and then we leave women out of that. But a comment was made that, you know, women buy into patriarchy in certain ways too, right? They reinforce this. I mean, if you like, I mean, at least part of my work is on hip hop, and if you look at women in hip hop, right, you look at old school, I don't know, I don't know. So if you look at like earlier American hip hop, it was completely different than what it is now. But women in hip hop have sort of adopted the kind of violence rhetoric and particularly sexualized rhetoric against like other women and other men, and that's what I'm talking about. Like that's an adoption of the patriarchy and its institutions and its language in order to get ahead in the system, right? But this is the perpetrators now we're talking about would be women. Are they the you know, by and large, the perpetrators of the patriarchal system? Of course not, right? Like, no, I'm not saying none of that, right? This is mainly a male-dominated institution run and perpetuated by men. Fundamentally agree. No disagreements there. But once we start talking about the victims and the perpetrators, that's a different classification categories than if we're talking about gender-based violence and not say violence against women. Then you know, men and women, or whatever genders, however you want to put those genders together, however you want to arrange the genders. So that's my point. I think that victims and perpetrators opens up a dialogue about systems and institutions where I think if our focus is on, if we conflate, you know, victims with women and perpetrators or patriarchy with men, then we sort of get a gender-based system that doesn't account for the fluidity in which some people experience the violence, the gender-based violence against them.
I'm curious.
Go ahead, Natalie. Natalie, no, go ahead.
I'm curious to know if you believe that, because what I'm hearing is that the system and the victims should be held differently. And I'm curious to know that to like whether or not if we attack kind of like the people from the system and why it was formed in the first place, then we can agree that it served at a certain time where there were not even some of the groups, well, they were there, but they didn't have a voice. Some of the groups we're talking about today, like the gay people, the transgender people, even men talking about the violence that they experience was not a thing back then. So when we agree that that system no longer works today, I'm curious to know if that would be a process that would move this conversation forward in a way that maybe makes groups like women feel like the actual fundamental problem is not being addressed. So other than solving the symptoms or trying to attack the results of the actual fundamental piece, why not actually challenge the fundamental piece and then give grace or space for this to be received by the masses. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Natalie, are you saying that the efforts should be focused at the source and then everything else will come after? Is that what you're saying?
I think in the rooms that hold the actual power, so if we're talking government, the people make decisions, yes, it should be, it should be directed to the source using, like kind of like examples from these different things. Because if that's not challenged, I believe the people in power already, most of them, as we can see in any type of society, are still men, so if we're able to challenge the source and just help them see that that system is, they're working basically with a very, very backward system, with examples from the community stuff, the different groups that are being affected by that system, then I think it would just be a more 360 route to go than trying to bring up these cases without challenging that system, because that system is old, it's stayed, just like racism. And if that is not addressed, then I don't know how well these other systems will be addressed.
Yeah, and I think I fundamentally agree with you, and I'm so happy that you brought up another kind of institutional system of racism as well. There are many kind of like Black people that like uphold, support, and make sure that racism is entrenched for their own kind of self-benefit. However, we're not going to be focusing on those Black people like specifically. We're going to go after kind of the source. So, and I don't think they should be ignored, but I think I think it would make sense that you would kind of target your efforts at where the source and where the power center is. And in certain cases, that is kind of the institutions. However, institutions are not living things, they are run by people. Then we have to look who is in the room. And when you look into the room at in our country, and I think in America as well, it tends to be like white men in institutions of power as well. So it doesn't mean that they are the ones that are solely are the only ones that are able to dispose of the power. But however, if we look at the source, we have to look at where the power stems from. So that for me, I don't discount that obviously women are accessories and they can support patriarchy, but the efforts are not going to be directed at them when, if we talk about kind of power in society, especially in our context where it's very kind of tribal and very ethnic and very male dominated, they are a mere accessory. The power structure is with men of all shades over there. And then once you go into men, then there's a whole kind of things that sets them apart. So that's my takeaway to kind of Kobena's point, is that like I would not be dismissing that women don't take part in patriarchy, but I also think in terms of like GBV, patriarchy and male domination from the source and historically have gone together, and women have just taken in that system and in those institutions if they are given a seat at the table. And yeah.
So I want to clarify. My point is not about the women that participate or partake in the system. Like that's just an expression of the system, like not being restricted and limited to men, right? Everyone's playing the game. That's one. But by playing the game, so this is one of my points, but by playing the game, you have to buy into the rules, the systems, and do the work to uphold it. And so, just like the Black people that play the game of like, I'm only gonna you know, I'm gonna do what the system requires so I can get up a racialized system of like in the academy, right? I'm gonna do what it requires, right? Like I know that those people exist, and what they're doing is playing the rules of the game, and they're upholding the system, right? They're upholding the system while they play. That's not my point. My point is that when we look at who holds the power, as you're saying, right? It's not all men per se, right? It's a small scale of largely dominant men that hold an inordinate amount of power, with a bunch of other men that's just supporting that. What I'm saying is, my worry is that all those men that are supporting that but don't actually have power are believing the myths that they're going to somehow reach that pinnacle where they're able to dominate like others. Like, and so for me, I'm like, for those guys, I want to talk to those guys. Like, no, you have trauma, you've been violated, you've experienced this violence. What has the patriarchy gotten to you? What is it giving you? Like, that's sort of my worry, right? Like there's a bunch of other people who are invested in this system and holding it up, but they don't actually have any power within it. And so, you know, for me, like the people that are on the corner in the hood jumping other people, like, you still live in the same place as I do, right? Like, we all live, they like literally live around the corner from me. The systems that are oppressing you are not, they're not empowering you, right? Like, patriarchy isn't empowering you, and it's being violent to you. Like, let's talk about that violence. Let's talk about that trauma. It's not like they don't experience trauma. Let's talk about that, because that to me opens up one avenue where we can start to where we can disenfranchise them of whatever stakes they have in patriarchy.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear what you're saying in terms of like what is patriarchy kind of giving them. However, like in small communities, you don't even have to get anything. It's just your positionality in society, basically, and the space that you are able to hold and how you are seen, and if you are listened to. That's a benefit, yeah. So that's all it is. So I don't have to be in a position of power. I don't have to be the chief. I don't have to be the mayor. It's just how I am seen and how I move through society.
But
so
you're on too. You're also in an hierarchy, right? You also have the same limitations of some cop. You know what I'm saying? Some cop pulled me over. You know how many times I got pulled over by the officers? One time a cop put his hand on my scrotum. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not like to say like that's not only me. Like the cops ran with like impunity in New York City for years, stopping and frisking black men and brown men. As long as you got enough melanin, you got stopped. For years. It took a lawsuit. It took a few lawsuits to get that stopped. And so that's what I'm like, and that was not a violence that's perpetrated against women, right? Like that one, the stop and frisk and those sorts of violences at the hand of officers, that was not perpetrated by women. I've seen cops pull guns on people, like.
But that's a different. I would think, sorry, that would be a different system though, not just patriarchy, but more about institutional other systems that are targeting men of color and that form of violence. Yes, patriarchy is in the mix, but there's another institution that's also at play. And I think that's where intersectionality comes in as well. But I want to stop speaking and let someone else say something.
Yeah, can I step in as the not young person here? Just what I want to do is tell you what I've learned in all of these. I think there's just so much wisdom here. But here's something that I think is important, and that is, I always want to ask why. You know, the point about women in hip hop, for instance, assuming certain quote unquote masculine identities. My question is why? If they had other options, maybe they would veer in a different direction. And it goes back to what you say about power and the things that society has institutionalized, so that we come to that belief. We're almost brainwashed into believing, I've got to do this to survive. I've got to embrace this. I've got to accept this. I can't resist this. Otherwise, there's no room for survival. So the why is always important to me, as well as the thing about police, going after Black and brown men or men of color. That's where they see the threat. They don't love Black women. I don't think anyway. There's no proof to that, but that's where they feel the threat, probably comes from. The other thing is when violence happens, for the first time today, I'm thinking, when is it violence because it's a part of the culture or a part of a system? And when is it violence because of who I am? Whether it's my identity as female, male, gay, or whatever. For instance, in secondary school, and I went to secondary school in Nigeria, it was common practice, corporal punishment, meaning you could flog, beat, slap students. They did that to me, but it wasn't because I was a boy. It's just because it was prevalent, and it probably still is in certain schools. The thing about violence that focuses predominantly on males, like you talk about Brooklyn, it reminds me of gays in say, Nigeria. When we hear that there's violence against gays in Nigeria, it's not against lesbians. It's when they say homosexuals, they predominantly mean the men. And why? Because the vast majority of people making these laws against and being hostile towards gays are heterosexual men in parliament or in the legislative body or their ministers or their lawmakers. And in their mind, this is my theory, the image of two women, being naked in bed doesn't offend them. What offends them, as well as those who agree with them, is two men. So that's where most of the violence is. It's against homosexual, as in homosexual men. So I'm agreeing with the point that there's a lot of violence that targets, but a lot depends on the society. It also depends on period, because there was a long time in Nigeria where nobody really cared. Then suddenly the topic became almost a universal topic. And now everybody's like looking for whose neighbor is gay and isn't, and is, I believe a lot of innocent people are being targeted. You're 40 years old and you're not married. Oh, you must be gay. So I'm agreeing with that. I'm completely agreeing with that. I can think about, say, the war that took place in my country. Most of the target was boys and men. Whenever the enemy came in, they went after boys and men. That was where that's who they thought was threatening. So I think part of this is maybe how we define masculinity and what we think about when we think about masculinity, that somehow it has to be affiliated with aggression. And if you don't express that aggression under certain circumstances, then you're not really male, quote unquote. So maybe there's room to rediscuss what we think about and how we define masculinity and how we express it. And by the way, during the war, I'm talking about while a lot of the boys and men were vulnerable to violence, just like Kwabena said, the women were vulnerable to sexual violence. That was what they were vulnerable, because they weren't seen as a physical threat. So, but they were still seen as nothing. So basically what I'm saying is, these are the things I'm thinking about and learning. I'm not disputing anything. I'm just letting you know that, you're forcing me to think, and I am thinking, so thank you.
So I just want to say again, I'm like the war story is important, right? Like it shows that men are still perpetrating violence against other men and women, just doing it in different ways, right? And so we need to talk about, when we talk about gender-based violence, we should include the ways in which like the young men and boys are going to be seen as threats, and so they get murdered, and that's equally as problematic as the women whose bodies are seen as disposable, and so they are raped and then probably murdered, right? Like femicide is real, So that's just what I'm saying, right? Like, and again, my worry is that if we somehow don't, if we just say like, oh yes, you don't experience violence, or it's not as bad as someone else, if we do that, you leave a place for patriarchy to fester. That's my worry. That is my worry. You leave a space, because you leave a space of violence untouched, and we have not talked about it. We have not engaged it. We have not said, you know what, there's some trauma there. May not be as much as everybody else, but there's something there worth investigating that we need to talk about. And so what the worry for me is that because no one's talked about it for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the next generation, this next kid is going to be subject to a problem that happened, way before he even was conceived, or she was conceived as an idea.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to begin I'm starting to begin to understand what you're talking about. I think because of the origins of GBV and how it came about in terms of its targeting of the violence from men to women, which are overly disproportionate. That's kind of why the conversation is centered that way, justifiably so, because stats kind of support that. However, I do definitely agree with you, especially in my country, in terms of the psychological trauma and the violence that young boys in particular tend to be subjugated to because of the spaces that they occupy and where they hang out, and how they can be very effective to a warlord or a drug trafficker. So young boys then suffer specific forms of violence because, once again, of their positionality in society. I understand kind of what you're speaking about. Whether it falls part of GBV or is another conversation, I'm still deciding. Because you did ask that question earlier on.
Yeah, I don't, my worry is that once it falls out of GBV, then I wonder now, have we conflated violence against women with gender-based violence? And now there's a space in which we can just not talk about the men and boys.
And there would be a very valid argument for conflating violence against women as gender-based violence. Would you disagree?
What was that?
Would you disagree that we could argue that we can conflate violence against women as gender-based violence? That could be a valid argument, statistically so.
I think I disagree with that, and for two reasons. One, the very term gender and women are not synonymous. So linguistically, that I think we have, those categories are different for a reason. But I think also just in the material lives that need to be changed. If we want to end violence against women, we still have to end violence against men, right? Like this is I think the kind of fictions that I think too many people run around with, that is we're going to end violence against women and continue violence against men. I think that's a fundamental fiction that plays in the minds of too many people. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, basically you're saying violence, we can't tolerate it on any level. If you're diversifying the conversation that way, absolutely, I agree with you. And yes, perhaps there are areas that haven't received as much focus because, like Masikole said, when the problem starts, we tend to identify where it seems to be most and focus there and forget about other areas. For instance, just listening to everyone talk, I'm just thinking about the problem we've had on the African continent for a long time with child soldiers. The vast majority of child soldiers are boys. And these boys are not only killed, forced to go and kill. Many times the initial training they have is within their communities. You've got to show that you're tough by killing your parents or killing members of your community, they're subject to rape, and it's mostly boys. Does it mean girls are not involved? They're not child soldiers? Not at all. But again, if we open up the conversation, and I think this is part of what I'm hearing, and we begin to explore it much more comprehensively than from a narrow lens, then there's room to address the problem, resolve the problem on a much more comprehensive level, which should be the goal. At least that's what I'm hearing. And I just use the example of child soldiers because that's the truth. And at some point, you had, when you look at the entire continent, you had close to maybe 50,000 boys being used in this capacity. And it was all about violence and nothing else. And most of those boys will never, I don't know if any of them will fully recover. For those of them that don't die and get back to their communities, I don't think recovery is even an option for them. So yes, I'm agreeing that we can expand the conversation and not just limit it like often happens. And by the way, there's some other practices, we talked about culture, there's still, unfortunately, it's some of these customs are dying, but they're there like female genital mutilation, forced marriage, again, the primary victims are girls when you look at those areas. But, we can't look at one and ignore the other because at some point it is a systematic and power problem or institutional problem and needs to be addressed from that capacity. Because whenever people are being abused, someone, at least in their mind, thinks they're gaining something. Whether the gain is emotional or whether it's political or economic. So yeah, I'm basically just adding to what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with those sentiments as well. I was just thinking that I suppose this is obviously open for debate in terms of the specific violence that young boys and men suffer under or are exposed to or targeted. It doesn't, just because it's not happening in GBV or it falls under GBV does not necessarily mean it's a whole conversation that just gets left behind either. Just because we're speaking about like breast cancer awareness does not mean like we're not going to speak about all the other cancers that are happening in society. However, I do think it would be beneficial to have the conversation closely aligned to GBV, but at the same time, I'm also hesitant because I understand that specifically GBV is targeting violence perpetuated by men against women. Specifically, that's where it stems from. That's the origin. And which is very, very valid as well. So where to position the very valid conversation that Kobena has brought up, I'm just still not aware of. I'm still not sure of, but it's definitely a conversation that is definitely prevalent, as you said, all over Africa and definitely in the Bronx, not Bronx, sorry, Brooklyn. I'm not sure why I thought about that first.
Yeah, it's very interesting, you guys. Like, what I also wanted to ask is, like, in terms of what Kwabena was talking about, is that should there maybe then be a different kind of focus or movement for that issue? Because when you start grouping all of these things, we're talking about gender-based violence, and when you say gender-based, you're focusing on the gender that is mostly affected by that violence. And when we start including everyone, the other gender which is also affected, the conversation starts getting, we go back and forth, and then we end up not really addressing issues. And then I was just asking, maybe is it better to always, when we find that, okay, there is another problem, which is really a huge problem, should we then maybe create a different focus that directly talks to that without interfering with other issues?
Maybe
I
like it's,
think
go ahead,
from
let's
this,
go. Go ahead.
from the conversation now is that it's not necessarily how we address the gender aspect of gender-based violence, is what kind of violence do we then speak of? That's just my thought.
Are you kind of saying that if we start speaking about like all forms of violence, then it will just evolve into too much happening?
I think what she's saying is maybe categorize it a little bit more. So, like I talked about violence against homosexuals in Nigeria. We're going to be focusing mostly on boys and men if we focus there. And if you talk about domestic violence, it's predominantly women that have been victims of that. So if you begin to categorize it, you look at child soldiers, maybe that's a way to go. I don't know, maybe someone has a different opinion on this, but I think categorizing rather than lumping everything together might be a start.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sego is right. I think she's like that. Just by including more forms of violence, and we'll start to see like the kinds of ways that different genders, different gender identities are oppressed,
exposed.
What was that?
No, sorry, that's fine. You got it.
Oh yeah, but are linked together too. So also the thing for me is that like, because this is a patriarchal system, right? Like it's still that these violences are interwoven with patriarchy. You know what I'm saying? I just think that like it's the weaving that we're missing. You know what I'm saying? So like, if watching my mom sew something, right? Like she had all these different cloths. It's the weaving that we're missing. And if we can start to talk about the other kinds of violence, then we can get a greater narrative of how patriarchy is weaving itself into these different things, and how we can sort of maybe undo it at the seams.
I feel like it's still, yeah. Sorry, let's hope
you can continue with something different that I wanted to comment on, which Philip spoke about before earlier, about how the book which talks about looking at our own culture and how we deal with things. And the interesting part is when talking, I didn't really get the whole idea of the book, but it reminded me of how for our culture, the Zulus, if a traditional healer is, they'll say you have a spirit, the spirit that possesses you could be of a female or a male. And that is addressed to the elders, and it's talked about, and everyone in the community or village will understand, okay, this guy is possessed by a female spirit. So if you see him behaving in this way, that's why, and it's accepted. So we have tend to really infuse our cultures, and yeah, it was that which I wanted to point out earlier. It was an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think, Kobena, with regards to the interwoven and intersectionality that you're speaking about, I still think it's going to come back to the notion that majority of the work that needs to be done in this area and in other areas is still going to be with men. I'm not saying that women are absolved completely. However, I feel like that's where we don't want to get it diluted in terms of like in American discourse. Oh, both sides, both parties are responsible for this, or everyone is responsible. I still think the target market of the movement is still getting men to do the work, because even now I would understand, now I would be open to change my opinion if you were saying that the people that are doing the jumping to the boys and men specifically were women. Then I'd be like, okay, cool. So it looks like we've got like female gangsters that are jumping people, but it's still men who are at the forefront of the violence. So so I agree with everything you said. I think it took me a while to get my head around it, but yeah, that's what I've got to say.
So let me because I
I think also the way we think about the gender aspect of GBV is highly problematic as well, because we think of it as men against women and men against men, but seldom do we look at how women are also being violent towards other genders and within the gender itself. So that's why maybe, Masqole, you are finding it a little bit hard to understand where Kwabena is coming from when he is speaking about his perspective of gender-based violence.
I understand, yeah, I may be being problematic, and maybe that's work that I need to do, because I think I could
No,
say
you're not
that,
being problematic. I'm just saying, don't accuse yourself.
Yeah, in terms of like, I can identify with certain parts of Kwabena's experience in terms of the violent community kind of setting, in terms of being rooted there. However, my lens from that society has informed me to not see women as violent and see men as violent, because they're the ones that are robbing people and killing people in the community.